My name's Graham Zellick, and I spent a very long time at what was then Queen Mary College and then became Queen Mary and Westfield College, and has since changed its name once or twice again. But it was Queen Mary College when I first went there in 1971. It was my first job after leaving university. And I stayed, believe it or not, very nearly 30 years. 20 years in the law faculty, and then the rest of the time as principal. But in the law faculty, I started in 1971, just a year after leaving Cambridge, and I'd had a year in America. I was appointed a temporary lecturer while one of the established lecturers went off to study at Yale. So I only had a one-year contract, and I thought that would be all right because my ambition at the time was to be a barrister and not to be an academic, but I quite liked the idea of doing some teaching and continue to do some writing. So it was my first job, but I never managed to leave really until I was very nearly middle-aged. I found it a very congenial and collegial place to work. And I enjoyed it immensely. As I say, I started as a temporary lecturer. At the end of the year, I was extended, I think, by a year or maybe two. And eventually I got a proper lectureship. I was then thinking that perhaps the time had come when I ought to leave, and I was made a reader, which was quite a big jump and a very welcome one. So I thought, well, I can't leave now, I must stay. And not many years after that, I was appointed Professor of Public Law, which of course meant I needed to stay a bit longer. But I'd not been a professor for very long when I was invited to become head of department and also dean. In those days they were distinct jobs, but we tended to have the same person doing both. So I was head of department and dean of the faculty. So the deanship is elected by one's colleagues, and the head of department's in the gift of the principal. And after a little while, I found that it was leaving me very little time to do research and writing, because at the same time I was also editing Public Law, which is the main journal in my field. And I was the founding editor of European Human Rights Reports, which was another big innovation in my area. So I gave up the deanship, which Ross Cranston very kindly took on, but I continued as head of department just for a couple of years, because then the college ran into severe financial and administrative difficulties, and I was invited initially to take on the role of acting principal, and then after I think 8 or 9 months I was asked if I would take on the substantive role, and I remained in that role for about 8 years. When I first joined Queen Mary, it was a very, very different institution from the one that anyone will recognise today. For a start, it was very small. The entire college, which was entirely, of course, on one site, the 1 Mile End campus. I think the entire college had no more than 3,000 students. The law faculty, which had only been established a few years before I joined, I think 1966 or thereabouts, and I joined in 1971, so it was very new. It was very small. It was in this building on the Mile End Road, which has since been remarkably modernised and refurbished, but had not been really refurbished and was not exactly much of an advertisement. But it was a very congenial place to work, and the law school in particular was very collegial and friendly. It didn't have much of a research culture. I taught criminal law and public law, well, we didn't call it that then, I think we just called it constitutional and administrative law, to first year students. So I taught nearly all the first year students, in tutorials as well as giving lectures. I also taught some of the third year students, and of course I wouldn't have been much older than the third year students at that point. But it was a very friendly place. There was a group of us who were there every day. None of us worked from home. There were people who only came in for their teaching, but there was a nucleus of us who came in every day, whether we were teaching that day or not. And despite the heavy burdens on young academics, we met for coffee in the morning, we went for lunch together, we met for afternoon tea, we talked about our subjects and what we were working on, and we discussed the latest cases. And so anyway, it was very enriching and fulfilling and very satisfactory. I do, of course, have all sorts of memories, and it would be strange if I didn't, having spent nearly 30 years of my career there, albeit in different roles. And they were very satisfying years indeed. But I do remember in my very first term going to see the then head of department and dean, Professor Roger Crane, and it was his baby. He had created it, and it was I think the second law school that he had created. He'd also been the founding head of department at the University of Nottingham, which is a very fine law school indeed. And I went to see him and I said, Roger, it would be very helpful if we could have a photocopying machine in the building, perhaps located in the library. And of course, this was something that he found very difficult to deal with. And he said, well, there's no money for a photocopying machine. I said, well, the people who use it have to pay so that not only does it cover its costs, but it usually means that there's a surplus that will pay for the staff members who copy it for teaching and research purposes. I said, oh, well, I'll have to. He used to sort of gnaw his thumb when he was dealing with a difficult issue. He said, I'll have to think about it, but clearly the answer was no. This was a request that could not be met. Anyway, shortly after that, Roger went off on a sabbatical to teach in Australia, and Roy Good took over as acting head of department. And I must say, within weeks, I remember walking along from Mile End Station and seeing a very large rank Xerox van parked outside the law faculty as they were unloading a new photocopying machine. So, we did go from fairly, if you like, humble origins. I suppose the proudest thing that I would lay claim to has to be about people. Because what is any university department or any law school but the people in it who are doing the teaching and the writing and so on. And I suppose that's something that I gave most attention to. And I was very pleased to have been a party to appointments of Hazel Genn, Ginevra Richardson, Ross Cranston, Basil Marcasinis, and various other people. They may not have stayed forever because people are much more mobile than they were once upon a time, where you went somewhere and you stayed for the whole of your career. And they were usually so good that there were other universities that were very keen to have them. But I think if I was to be judged by any measure, it would be those kinds of people who came into the law school and gave it a reputation. And I remember feeling great satisfaction when we had the first research assessment exercise, which was very new for everybody. And although I'm not much of a fan of the research assessment exercise, I think in many ways it's misconceived. We got a 5, which I think at that time was the highest grade, and that was very gratifying. And I think it was the beginning of, if you like, the eminence which has been maintained to this day of the law faculty. What advice might I give to anyone thinking of studying law or coming to Queen Mary to study law these days? Well, I must say, in the first place, I don't think I would be so presumptuous as to offer any advice. I think the only thing what one probably can say is that it's likely to be very different, not least as a result of artificial intelligence, but I dare say there are all sorts of other factors that will bear down on making professional life and public service and all sorts of things very different. But the one thing I would say is that whatever those changes are, and remember too that not everybody who comes to read law at a university is going to be a practicing lawyer. By no means is that true, and it's never been the case. The fact is that there is something about the discipline of law, its methodology, its ways of thinking, that is immensely valuable, an immensely valuable intellectual training. And I can't see any reason why that should change. There may be different subjects on the syllabus, there may be different emphases, but those basic skills that characterize and define the discipline of law will remain, just as they are in the case, say, of classics, or archaeology, or whatever it is. All of these things are fast changing. Medicine is fast changing. But there are basic aspects of the discipline which, and in the case of law, that is, trying to ascertain the principle, trying to relate the purposes of law to social needs.